She never asked for wealth, only a quiet corner of the world where she could be seen. He had everything, except a name anyone remembered. In the silence between pruning shears and pages of poetry, something bloomed between them, but she had no idea. The man tending her roses would one day own the entire estate. Cecilia Langley knew how to walk without making a sound. It was something she'd mastered growing up in the servant quarters of Windermere Hall, a sprawling estate tucked away beyond the rolling hills of Surrey. Her mother was the head housekeeper. Her father, once the groundskeeper, had died of pneumonia when she was 12. Since then, Cecilia had learned to live like ivy, quiet, clinging to edges, finding light where no one looked. She had her routine. Help her mother fold linens, sneak down to the greenhouse during lunch hours, and read books left behind by guests long gone. The roses always listened, even when no one else did. Windermere was in its twilight years. The Langley family, the noble bloods who owned it, were deep in debt but too proud to downsize. Lady Rosalind kept hosting garden teas to maintain appearances, and her son Henry, a man of wealth but no vision, visited occasionally from London, often leaving the staff uneasy. It was during one of those long summer weeks, when guests swirled in silk and champagne, that the new gardener arrived. No one introduced him properly. He came with a shovel and gloves, not a resume. Tall, quiet, his hair tousled by wind, he worked from dawn until the stars came out, never saying more than a word or two. The other staff called him the Mute, but Cecilia saw something else. The first time they spoke was over a broken trowel. Cecilia had slipped into the greenhouse as usual, book in hand, only to find him kneeling by the potting bench. "It's rusted through," he said, surprising her. His voice was low, rough, not from disuse, but restraint. She blinked. "I didn't think you spoke." He gave a half smile. "Only when there's something worth saying." She knelt beside him, brushing soil from the table. "You new to this estate?" "New to most things lately," he replied. She never got his name that day, but when she left, he had tucked a small paper flower made from old gardening notes into the cover of her book. From then on, she visited more often. Sometimes they exchanged words, small, careful sentences. Sometimes they just worked side by side in silence. He showed her how to clip deadheads, how to talk to soil like it remembers grief. She showed him the poems she'd written in the margins of worn paperbacks. They shared tea from cracked thermoses, and once, in a moment she couldn't explain, he reached out and brushed a smudge of dirt from her cheek. She didn't move, neither did he, but the air between them shifted. Something fragile had begun to take root. Her mother noticed. "Don't get foolish, Cecilia," she warned. "He's not like us, but he's also not one of them. That kind, they disappear. And girls like us can't afford to fall for ghosts." Cecilia nodded, but didn't answer. She couldn't explain the way she felt when he was near. Not infatuation, but recognition, as if two people born invisible had finally turned to face each other. Still, she didn't even know his name. And in Windermere Hall, names were everything. Titles, inheritance, bloodlines, all spelled in gold frames along the hallway. She was just the housekeeper's daughter. He was just the gardener. Or so she thought. The first rain of late summer brought a hush over Windermere Hall. Guests canceled their afternoon walks. The maids rushed to close upper windows, and somewhere in the kitchen wing an old kettle whistled over a flickering flame. Cecilia slipped away from her mother's watchful eyes, clutching a thermos of sweetened tea and 2 tin cups wrapped in cloth. She didn't have to think about where her feet led her anymore. They knew the way to the greenhouse, through the east courtyard, past the sleeping ivy, and under the arch of clematis heavy with dew. When she arrived, he was already there, as always, tending to a stubborn patch of lavender that refused to grow. "For you," she said, setting the thermos down. He looked up, surprised, and smiled. "You didn't have to," she shrugged. "But I wanted to." They sat on upturned crates, the air thick with the scent of damp soil and wilted blossoms. Steam curled from their cups as the rain tapped against the glass panels overhead. "Why gardening?" she asked. He took a long sip before answering. "Because it's the one place where life forgives you for making a mess. If you're willing to tend it." She looked at him, her fingers wrapped around the tin cup. "That sounds like something someone said to you once." He chuckled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just what I needed to believe." There was always something guarded in the way he spoke, like he was protecting a door inside himself that hadn't been opened in years. Days passed, then weeks. Their visits became a quiet ritual. Sometimes he brought pastries from the village bakery. Other times she brought books. She started calling him Ash, though he never confirmed if that was his real name. "Short for Ashwood," he once said with a shrug. "My middle name, it's easier." She liked it. It suited him. Something strong, scarred, still standing. Windmere was filled with whispered gossip about Lord Henry's gambling debts and Lady Rosalind's fading health, but in the greenhouse none of that mattered. It was just the two of them, tucked between rosemary and rhododendrons, talking like the world was smaller than it really was. But not everyone missed the change in her demeanor. One afternoon, Cecilia returned to the main house to find her mother waiting at the servants' entrance, arms folded. "You've been spending too much time with him." "He's kind," Cecilia replied. "He listens." Her mother's gaze didn't soften. "Kindness is not love, and listening doesn't mean he'll stay. Remember what happened to Sarah Bennet? Fell for the stable boy. He vanished when she was with child." Cecilia flinched. "This isn't the same." "No," her mother said quietly. "But the ending might be." That night, Cecilia sat by candlelight, rereading a passage Ash had marked in a book she'd lent him. "Some flowers only bloom in secret, not for fear of the sun, but because they were never meant to be seen. Still, the heart does not listen to warnings. It follows warmth." And warmth was what she found one morning when she opened the greenhouse door to find a wooden box carved with vines and wildflowers. Inside was a simple hand-bound book of pressed leaves, each labeled with the date and the spot they found it in the garden. On the inside cover, "For the girl who made weeds feel worthy." Her breath caught. She clutched the book to her chest and stood there for a long time. In a world obsessed with names, titles, and gold frames, he had given her something else entirely. Remembrance, meaning, a garden made of moments. And in that moment she realized, whatever this was, it had already taken root. The morning began like many others. Cecilia made her way through the fog-covered garden with a pastry wrapped in cloth, humming softly. But something was different. She felt it before she saw it. An eerie quiet, a tension in the air. When she reached the greenhouse, Ash wasn't there. In his place was Lady Rosalind's steward, pacing like a crow waiting to strike. "Miss Langley," he said curtly. "You're needed in the drawing room." Confused, she followed. The house was too silent, the kind that precedes storm. Inside the drawing room stood Lord Henry, returned from London unannounced, and her mother, eyes tight with worry. "It seems," Henry said coolly, "our gardener has forgotten his place." He spoke of impropriety, of rumors among guests, of Cecilia being seen too often, too comfortably with someone beneath her station. "I won't have scandal, taint Windmere," he sneered. "The help must remain help," Cecilia protested vehemently, desperately, but her voice fell flat against decades of entitlement. Lady Rosalind, pale and distant, said nothing. Her mother pulled her aside after. "Don't make it worse, see. Let it pass." But it didn't pass. That afternoon, Ash was gone. No farewell, no letter. Only his gloves, folded neatly on the potting bench, and the pressed leaf book she had given back to him the week before. She held it to her chest and wept among the roses they had once replanted together. The days that followed felt hollow. Cecilia wandered the estate like a ghost. The garden grew wild without his care. The greenhouse, once warm and humming, now smelled of mildew and absence. Guests came and went, unaware of what had been lost beneath their feet. Cecilia tried writing a letter, then tore it up. She considered leaving Windermere altogether. But something rooted her there, something more than grief. She tended the plants herself, poorly at first. She whispered to the soil like he'd taught her. "You have to talk to them," he once said. "They won't bloom for silence." But silence was all she had left. Weeks passed. Then one morning her mother handed her a letter. No return address, no signature. Inside was a small card pressed with the symbol of a single ash tree. The message: "I'm sorry I left that way. I didn't want to make things harder for you. But I never lied, Cecilia. Everything I felt was real." She read it over and over until the ink blurred. She had no way to find him, no clue where he'd gone. But in that moment, something shifted. She stopped grieving like a girl abandoned, and started tending her days like a woman choosing to grow. It was nearly a month later when the rumors began. A buyer had purchased Windermere, a private sale, anonymous. The Langley estate, with its centuries of faded glory and overgrown gardens, was changing hands. Cecilia sat stunned at the kitchen table, listening to staff whisper theories. A foreign investor? A real estate tycoon? Lady Rosalind seemed calm, resigned even. Lord Henry was furious. "They'll tear it down," he barked heavily, like everything else. But Cecilia wasn't so sure. That evening she walked to the greenhouse. On the gate was a new lock, and a fresh rose tied in twine. Her heart skipped. Something wasn't ending, something was returning. It was a Friday when the staff gathered in the parlor, summoned for an announcement. Lady Rosalind stood near the fireplace with a folded letter in her hand and her usual calm composure, though Cecilia noticed the way her fingers trembled. "Windermere has been sold," she said simply. Murmurs erupted. "Effective immediately, we are to prepare for transition. The new owner will arrive tomorrow." No name was mentioned, just that. A door closing. Cecilia's heart raced, not from dread but from something stranger. Hope. That night she returned to the greenhouse once more. The rose tied in twine remained fresh. A sign, a promise. The next day, a sleek black car pulled into the gravel drive. Out stepped a man in a tailored gray coat, hands bare, eyes steady. He paused at the steps of the estate as if measuring time. Then he removed his coat, slung it over one shoulder, and walked past the main door, toward the greenhouse. Cecilia stood inside, surrounded by the vines she had tried so hard to keep alive. When the door creaked open, she turned, expecting a stranger. Her breath caught. It was Ash, but not as she remembered him. The soil-stained clothes were gone, replaced with elegance. Yet his eyes held the same ache, the same calm, the same quiet love. "I bought Windermere," he said softly, as if it were nothing. "Not to tear it down. To give it back its soul." Cecilia couldn't speak. He stepped closer. "You told me once that some things only bloom in secret, but I didn't want us to be a secret anymore." She felt tears rising. "Why didn't you tell me who you really were?" "Because back then I didn't know," he admitted. "I left my family's world, the money, the titles. I wanted to see what it felt like to earn something honest. Then I met you. And I knew I'd rather dig in dirt beside you than dine with anyone else beneath crystal chandelier. Lady Rosalind allowed the transition without protest. Lord Henry left in a fury, vowing to contest the sale. But Ashe didn't care. Papers were signed, wages were raised, the gardens were restored, Windermere's heart began to beat again. And at its center was the greenhouse. Ashe didn't move into the manor. He stayed in the old gardener's cottage, renovated but humble. Cecilia came often, not as a servant, not as a guest, but as something more. They replanted the roses together, laughed in the sun, wrote poems on seed packets, and though no one said the word aloud, love lived in every glance, every shared silence, every root taking hold in the soil. On the morning of the first spring bloom, Ashe placed something small on the greenhouse bench, a carved wooden box inside of which was the paper flower he had made her long ago. Beneath it, a note, for the one who saw me before I even knew who I was. Cecilia held it to her chest as she had once done with his gloves. When he walked in moments later, she didn't ask questions. She simply whispered, "Stay." He nodded. No declarations, no grand gestures, just a gardener who once planted hope, and a girl who once believed weeds deserved to grow. Together, they had found a way to bloom. Spring unfolded like a secret across Windermere. The air held warmth again, and the gardens, long dormant, began to stretch and wake under Ashe's careful hands. Cecilia had taken to walking the grounds early, barefoot in dew-soaked grass, her mind still catching up with the life that was now hers. She was no longer the housekeeper's daughter, hiding behind greenhouse doors. She was part of something growing, not just in soil, but in soul. One morning she found Ashe kneeling in the orchard, planting a fig tree. "For the next girl who grows up in the shadows," he said, "so she'll always have something sweet waiting." She didn't speak, just knelt beside him and dug her hands into the dirt. News of Windermere's transformation began to spread. What was once seen as a fading estate had become a place of renewal. Local children were invited to visit the gardens. The old library wing reopened, restored and stocked with donated books. Cecilia took charge of a new writing program, teaching poetry and journaling beneath the same willow tree she once cried under alone. But with the attention came questions. Who was Ashe, really? Why had a man with such wealth chosen this forgotten place? Journalists speculated. Former friends of Lord Henry returned, suddenly interested. Ashe remained calm, polite, but distant. "I don't owe anyone a version of myself they can write about," he told Cecilia. "Only the one you already know." One afternoon, while sorting old ledgers in the study, Cecilia came across a box labeled Langley 1974. Inside were yellowed photographs of her father in the gardens, standing proud beside roses with baby Cecilia on his shoulders. There was also a letter of commendation, one that had never been given. Her throat tightened. When Ashe found her sitting alone with the box in her lap, she handed him a photo. Ashe loved this place before anyone else did. Ashe studied the image, then placed it beside a new seed packet. "Then let's make sure his roots remain. We'll name the West Grove after him, Langley's Orchard. And every child who passes through will know he was here first." Despite the peace they'd built, something still lingered in Cecilia's chest, a fear that it was all too good. One evening, as they watched the sun set from the old stone wall behind the estate, she finally asked, "Why me?" Ashe turned toward her, brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in depth. "Because you never looked at me like I owed you something. Because you never asked for more than honesty, and because when everything was stripped away, titles, money, history, you still believed in what we made with our hands." She nodded slowly, tears brimming. "I just don't want to wake up one day and find the garden empty again." He took her hand. Then let's build something too rooted to run. On the anniversary of his return, Ash led Cecilia to a quiet corner of the greenhouse. There, beneath glass streaked with rain and ivy, stood a new bench, hand-carved, polished with care. On its back was a single line, etched in his writing: "To the girl who taught the gardener to stay." He knelt, not with a ring, but with a packet of seeds. "Let's plant a life," he said, "the kind that keeps growing." She took the seeds with both hands. In Windmere, where once silence ruled, the only sound now was laughter, blooming like wildflowers. The weeds had never stood a chance. Summer arrived with a gentleness Windmere hadn't known in decades. The estate, once faded and forgotten, now pulsed with the rhythm of community. Neighbors who had once passed with lowered eyes now gathered on Sunday afternoons for poetry readings under the willows, and children's scavenger hunts through the herb maze. Cecilia stood at the edge of the eastern garden, watching a group of schoolchildren harvest lavender for sachets. Ash was beside her, sleeves rolled, his hands dusty with soil and sun. "This is what you saw, isn't it?" she asked. "Not yet," he replied. "But it's getting closer." They had built more than just gardens. Windmere had become a sanctuary for voices that had long been silenced: artists, laborers, lost youth looking for a place to land. Ash established a grant under Cecilia's name for young writers from working-class families. She resisted at first, embarrassed. "I'm not a legacy," she said. He smiled. "No, you're a beginning." The name stuck. The Langley Grant. People who had once whispered about the scandal of a gardener and a housekeeper's daughter now applauded their vision. Cecilia found it strange how quickly the world made space for you once you no longer asked permission. One late evening, as fireflies blinked over the orchard, Ash brought Cecilia to the greenhouse with a wrapped parcel in hand. "Open it," he said. Inside was an old ledger, restored, bound in green leather. The first page read, "Windmere's True History." Below it, a dedication for the people who kept the lights on when no one noticed. This is their story now. Cecilia flipped through the pages, finding testimonies from former maids, gardeners, cooks, and drivers. Ash had tracked them down, recorded their memories, and preserved them. "This place belonged to more than one family," he said, "and its history should too." The following spring, Ash proposed, not with a diamond, but with a hand-drawn map of the estate. At the center, a new structure to be built. A school, a library, and a garden woven into one. "Not just for us," he said, "but for every version of us that never got the chance." Cecilia said yes with tears on her cheeks and soil on her hands. The wedding was quiet, under the fig tree they'd planted together. No grand gowns, no nobility. Just the people who mattered, standing barefoot in the grass, watching two souls who'd grown side by side finally choose to stay. Years passed. The gardens grew wilder, freer. The library shelves stretched longer. Children now ran through the halls of Windmere, their laughter echoing off the same walls that once held only silence. On the last page of Windmere's new guest book sat a line in Cecilia's hand. "We thought we were just tending flowers, but all along we were cultivating hope." And beside it, Ash had written, "And planting love deep enough to last generations." In a world that once told them where they didn't belong, they'd built something that welcomed everyone. A garden. A home. A legacy they chose together.